Who qualifies for a benzene exposure lawsuit? Benzene exposure lawsuit claims are typically filed by workers and individuals who can document repeated contact with benzene through industrial work, fuel-related job duties, or long-term environmental contamination. Repeated exposure has been linked to serious health effects that often involve the bone marrow and blood-forming system, including leukemia and other life-altering disorders. Gianaris Trial Lawyers is reviewing claims from individuals who were exposed to benzene and later diagnosed with serious health problems such as acute myeloid leukemia, AML. Benzene lawsuits filed by victims of prolonged exposure. Overview. Benzene is classified as a known human carcinogen, and multiple federal agencies have linked repeated exposure to a higher risk of serious blood and bone marrow diseases. In many benzene cases, the exposure history involves long-term work around gasoline vapors, solvents, or industrial chemicals, with the highest risk often tied to occupational exposure. Benzene exposure may also occur outside the workplace, including in communities near chemical plants, where emissions and releases can contribute to ambient exposure. Understanding eligibility in benzene exposure claims. Eligibility in benzene exposure cases is usually driven by two questions: whether toxic exposure can be reasonably documented, whether a medically supported diagnosis links that exposure to serious health conditions. Benzene is widely treated as a high-priority hazard because it is a proven blood and bone marrow toxicant, and federal public health authorities recognize that long-term exposure can damage the body's ability to produce healthy blood cells and can impair the immune system. In practical terms, the core eligibility factors usually include a clear exposure pathway showing how toxic exposure occurred, evidence of elevated exposure conditions, a diagnosis consistent with benzene-associated disease, timing and latency consistency, documentation to support causation arguments. This framework explains why some claims qualify and others do not. A person can have real exposure without meeting the legal and medical thresholds required to move forward, particularly when exposure was brief or cannot be documented. Why benzene lawsuits focus on exposure history and medical diagnosis? Benzene lawsuits focus on exposure history and medical diagnosis because benzene poisoning is primarily a blood and bone marrow injury, and the strongest scientific evidence connects benzene to disrupted blood cell production and leukemia. Exposure history also matters in environmental exposure cases tied to hazardous waste sites, where benzene contamination can persist in groundwater or air over long periods and may involve overlapping contaminant profiles. Documented benzene exposure, the first qualification requirement. Documented benzene exposure is often the first gatekeeping issue in these cases because liability analysis begins with whether the exposure can be shown with enough specificity to be credible in litigation. Exposure documentation can come from employment records, job descriptions, safety data sheets, witness statements, air monitoring data, and environmental testing results when available. Without this documentation, it becomes difficult to argue that proving benzene exposure caused the illness is medically and legally supportable, even when the diagnosis is severe. Occupational benzene exposure, high-risk industries and job roles. Occupational exposure remains a central focus in many benzene exposure claims because the workplace is where sustained, repeated exposure is most likely to occur, often across years rather than isolated incidents. High-risk industries and job roles commonly associated with occupational benzene exposure include oil and gas, petroleum refining, chemical manufacturing and processing plants, rubber manufacturing and industrial solvent use, fuel distribution and storage, gas stations and fueling operations, railroad and industrial transportation work involving fuels and solvents, industrial maintenance and mechanical repair, steel mills, foundries, and heavy manufacturing, firefighting and hazardous materials response, incident-specific exposure, environmental and community exposure to benzene. Community exposure to benzene is often evaluated differently than workplace exposure because the sources are diffuse and the exposure pathways can involve both air and water over long periods. Communities that may be at risk of community-level benzene exposure include neighborhoods near oil refineries, residential areas located near chemical manufacturing plants, communities near Superfund (NPL) sites, areas near fuel terminals, neighborhoods near landfills or waste disposal sites, communities with known leaking underground storage tanks (USTs), areas served by municipal or private wells that have a history of VOC contamination, residential zones adjacent to high-traffic freight routes, medical conditions commonly associated with benzene exposure. Benzene is dangerous because it is a bone marrow toxicant that can interfere with the body's ability to produce healthy blood cells, which is why the most consistent long-term harms involve the blood-forming system. Benzene enters the body primarily through inhalation of contaminated air, but it can also be absorbed through the skin and ingested through contaminated water. And ATSDR notes that it can circulate in the bloodstream and be stored temporarily in bone marrow and fat. Because benzene-related blood cancers and marrow disorders often develop after prolonged exposure and may not appear until years later, eligibility screening and medical review typically account for latency, the timing of symptoms, and whether earlier blood abnormalities were documented before diagnosis. Acute myeloid leukemia, AML, and related leukemias. Acute myeloid leukemia, AML, is the cancer most consistently and strongly associated with benzene exposure in toxicology and epidemiology, which is why it is often treated as the central diagnosis in benzene exposure claims. Benzene's primary target is the bone marrow, where blood cells are produced, and long-term exposure has been linked to marrow suppression, abnormal blood counts, and later development of myeloid malignancies. Other blood and bone marrow disorders linked to benzene exposure. Benzene exposure is not only linked to acute myeloid leukemia, AML, it is also associated with a broader set of blood and bone marrow disorders that reflect the same underlying injury pattern, damage to the marrow's ability to make healthy blood cells. Blood and bone marrow disorders commonly discussed in benzene exposure claims. Myelodysplastic syndromes, MDS, aplastic anemia, pancytopenia, and chronic bone marrow suppression. Diagnosis can often come years after initial exposure to benzene. Latency is the period between a person's first meaningful exposure to a toxic chemical and the point when a diagnosable disease appears. In benzene exposure cases, latency is significant because benzene-related blood cancers and bone marrow disorders often develop gradually after long-term injury to the marrow rather than immediate clinical collapse. A diagnosis that occurs years after exposure can still be medically consistent with benzene's known toxic profile, but it requires a careful timeline showing when exposure occurred, how long it lasted, and what symptoms or blood abnormalities appeared along the way. Do you qualify for a benzene exposure lawsuit? You may qualify for a benzene exposure lawsuit if you can document meaningful exposure and have been diagnosed with a serious blood or bone marrow condition consistent with benzene toxicity. A diagnosis alone is not enough. The case also depends on whether the exposure can be supported through records, witness statements, job histories, industrial monitoring, or environmental data. A legal review can help determine whether the exposure circumstances and medical evidence support a claim, and whether the claim is still within the applicable statute of limitations. Common evidence used in a benzene exposure lawsuit. Benzene claims are evidence-driven because the core dispute in most cases is whether the exposure occurred at meaningful levels and whether it can be linked to a specific diagnosis. Potential evidence in a benzene exposure lawsuit may include employment records, job descriptions, safety data sheets, SDS, industrial hygiene records, work orders, maintenance logs, and task sheets, witness statements from coworkers, incident reports, spill logs, and emergency response documentation, medical records confirming diagnosis and treatment, laboratory results showing abnormal blood counts over time, CBC trends, bone marrow biopsy reports, pharmacy records and treatment timelines, smoking history and medical history documentation, potential compensation in a benzene exposure claim. In civil benzene cases, damages refers to the categories of harm a plaintiff may seek to recover after an illness or death allegedly caused by toxic exposure. Benzene lawyers typically assess damages by reviewing objective records and then projecting future needs based on the expected course of the disease. Potential damages in a benzene exposure lawsuit may include past and future medical expenses, costs of ongoing monitoring and follow-up care, lost wages and lost earning capacity, out-of-pocket costs related to treatment, pain and suffering, emotional distress and mental health impacts, loss of normal life and daily functioning, loss of consortium, wrongful death damages, punitive damages. Who typically does not qualify for a benzene exposure lawsuit? Not every benzene exposure claim qualifies for litigation, even when a person believes benzene played a role in their health condition. Examples of situations where a person typically does not qualify include no documented exposure history, short-term or minimal exposure, a diagnosis that is not supported by current benzene-related medical science, medical records showing an alternative likely cause, symptoms without a confirmed diagnosis, claims filed outside the statute of limitations, exposure limited to general background sources, inability to connect the exposure to a defendant. Gianaris Trial Lawyers, investigating benzene lawsuits. Gianaris Trial Lawyers is investigating benzene exposure lawsuits involving leukemia and other serious blood-related conditions, including cases arising from occupational exposure and long-term community contamination. If you believe benzene exposure may have contributed to your diagnosis or to the death of a family member, contact Gianaris Trial Lawyers to request a confidential case review. You can also use the chat feature on this page to get in touch with our benzene lawyers.